COVID-19 pandemic has had quite a bit of an effect on our teaching, and of course on our whole working in the department. Obviously, online teaching creates situations that change your relationships to students to such an extent that very different things come to the fore, and you can actually generalize, I think, by saying that. We've seen in the past year or so, we've seen global relationships or aspects of global relationships actually amplified, becoming accentuated, bigger by COVID. Right? African countries are being pushed further into the situation of medical dependency, nationalist egoism. Is everywhere. All those things are there, but in in relation to our teaching, there were also some very special things going on that's sometimes that have to do with ethnography and decolonizing ethnography, but also very much with issues of diversity. And one of the effects of the COVID-19 pandemic on teaching ethnography was that some of the principles that we already incorporated in the master program that really teaches students a hands-on research experience of their own design, so it still has this individualistic style to it, which is inevitable because you have to give a person a grade. It becomes more difficult when you have to give two persons a grade, right? So we ask them to do their individual projects. But they can officially also, they are sometimes allowed to collaborate in projects. And in any case, we teach them very explicitly collaboration with research participants. And current generations of students take that up very explicitly. So with that teaching in mind, with the idea that you enter into a social relationships, you bring to those social relationships your own person with its abilities, but also with its limitations, right? Not every male has access to certain gendered circles, and he will not get to hear what maybe a female researcher might learn from a certain group of people. We teach them to explicitly incorporate their own being, their own person, and their own background, and first of all, make use of it with research participants, but also to try and amplify the ways in which they contribute something to the group of people that is their research target, you could say. Often also in relation to a specific audience. So we want to stop thinking in terms of the dichotomy of researcher and research participant, because there's always more to it. And this is also what nowadays is discussed, at least in our department, in terms of multimodality. It's both in the social sense, there are more modes of social interaction, just as much as it is in what you could call the technical and sensory sense, where you have more modes of communication that work, have always worked in ethnographic field research. Because participant observation, for example, is something that uses different senses than the interview to some extent. And it assumes that there are certain things that you can learn that you may not be able to learn when you talk to people, that are not verbally exchanged. So these contents of our teaching were already there. And then, all of a sudden students got the message, you cannot go into the field. right? You have to stay at home behind the computer. Some of my students had to give up when that happened in March last year. They didn't know what to do. Some of them felt they had to go home. One was Italian, the other Australian. Third one was, I think, Peruvian. So I was left with 2 students who persevered and who taught me that it is possible to do effective and productive ethnographic research within the limitations of the pandemic, with creative use of online platforms, redefining oneself, not just as, say, someone who has to objectively record things out there, but by, setting up your own internet platform, your own Facebook page or whatever, creating social circumstances that invited other people to come in, and thereby, in a way, creating your own population. And it started different ways of thinking, for me at least, about how we engage with research participants, and it further demolished this positivist idea that to be really objective, we actually cannot be there in the social relationships that we study, which is a physical impossibility. So this whole change of the communication patterns also reminded me of something that actually Johannes Fabian taught me with one of his earliest articles, what is it, Language, History and Anthropology. I still think it's a brilliant piece, although it's too filled with neo-Marxist jargon for a lot of younger scholars to pick up immediately. But he basically said, ethnography is intersubjective. Intersubjectivity is based on the availability of communication channels between researchers and the people they interact with. And that means that the communicative context, which is historically formed, because it also depends, for example, on what languages people speak and can speak, and those situations are constantly changing, right? It's like we maybe discussed earlier. There are places in France where, or there are places in Africa where you used to be able to only work with French or Bambara or other African languages, and nowadays it might be possible to use a lot of English because the situations are changing. The same thing goes for the use of technology and communication technology in particular. So this last year has been a journey of discovery, but also with both positive and negative. The negative ones are especially what you learn when you teach students online in a large class, and I did so with 170 in the Diversity and Power class last spring. And you realize that you run a real risk when discussing issues of diversity, race, gender, sexuality, non-normative sexualities in particular, online, because it is no longer clear, also not to the students, what kind of communication is actually safe for them to use, when to keep your mouth shut, when to comment, because you not only, you are forced through the screen to listen to a lecturer, and you're completely dependent on the lecturer making room. And since you've already heard that I can talk long and for some length, I'm not exactly the most accessible lecturer on screen. I'm much more accessible in a live class because my senses pick up that there's unrest somewhere, or that people are discussing things, and I stop myself and I say, hey, what are you discussing, right? So I get this question and response reaction more easily than when I'm behind the screen. But at the same time, other forms of communication run through the chat, and in fact we had 2 chats. We had the chat and we had the question and answer chat. And then we had the administrative chat where we discussed with the moderator and with my colleague what was going on in all this. And I several times lost track and couldn't really find any way of controlling the situation. So this amplifies issues that students find both interesting as well as threatening as well as emotionally challenging. And diversity is identity in whatever guise is exactly that. You could always make mistakes. It's impossible to be sensitive to all identities, and it's also impossible to completely change your style, which I luckily learned partly through having one of our master students study the process while we were doing it. So you try to improve, but it's been an enormous challenge. At the same time, you are in a learning process. Because to give one example, you suddenly get messages from students who say, I'm chronically ill, I have difficulty coming to class, I'm exhausted after an hour in a classroom, and all that doesn't happen when I'm behind the screen. I can study far better because I'm just lying down, looking at my laptop, and I'm so much more at ease and have so much more energy that I learn much more. So you suddenly also you learn about disability, for example. What you also don't learn or unlearn is that you often only see names because there's no room to picture all the faces, which means that something like appearance also disappears. So you find yourself guessing at, for example, ethnicity by name, which is obviously something that is fraught with a lot of danger and with a lot of potential blundering, so to speak. So the whole pandemic is an amazing thing, and we should also very much take this as an opportunity to learn. And we are learning very fast, especially also with this new crew of teachers that we have, who are sensitive to these things, who actually help others also discuss it. So that also brings me to the one of the others answers to this question of whether you think anthropology is or should be heading. That is reflected in the work I do with people at museums in the Netherlands, especially ethnographic museums. And I'm finishing a book called Museum Temporalities, Time, History and the Ethnographic Museum, co-edited with Wayne Modest, who is also one of the directors of the National Museum of World Cultures. And the head of the Research Center for Material Culture, who embodies to some extent my own engagement with material culture, but also very much with decolonization, because our joint interest is very much how, again, temporal structures, you could say, are built into infrastructure and material culture. Of which the museum itself, and especially the Ethnographic Museum, is a prime example. Right? Here the ideas about what you could call the extinction destinations of a lot of peoples that were described or exhibited in ethnographic museums actually comes from Wayne. Wayne Modest thought of that, and I eagerly took it over because we are arguing, of course, with each other about what kind of temporal habits and structures are toxic and what kind of temporal habits are underdeveloped or should be developed more. Of course, it's easy to give some abstract answers, right? So the one that puts people into an ethnographic slot is highly problematic and has been demonstrably toxic. But that doesn't mean that the sort of the wonder that people have about the life of people that they don't know is immediately toxic as well. So that is one problem that I very much struggle with. There's a tendency among critics of the ethnographic museum to condemn exoticism in general. But I don't think that all of the exotic is equally evil, so to speak, or equally toxic. And I think a major question for anthropology as such is also to resolve that question of, what kind of interest in strange places is actually healthy and leads to empathy. And how can we actually cultivate that healthy form of empathy? Because it's quite clear that if you don't talk of it in terms of exoticism, but you talk of it in terms of empathy with different people, we suddenly all agree that this is something that we need to cherish and cultivate. It's important for our world because there's too little of it. Certainly in North Atlantic societies with their polarized forms of identity politics. But then there's the other thing that is so exciting here, and that is my original interest in history, in historical anthropology, because whatever you talk about in relation to museums, and this isn't restricted to ethnographic museums, is of course nowadays all taken up in questions of restitution, to whom do the objects in a museum actually belong, with different questions, different answers being given to those questions. And one of the things that is becoming increasingly important there is precisely this long-term historical perspective. Because we realize that restitution is a very strange word if you're talking about, a process that started 150 years ago with an object that was collected in a specific way, in a specific societal setting, maybe robbed, maybe indeed brought over to a museum as plunder by some powerful nation state or military group. But then it resided in a place for a long time, for example, as a museum object, which made it into something different. And then the question becomes in the present, if you say it has to be restituted to the people to whom it originally belonged, yes, of course, I would generally subscribe to that principle. But you should realize that you can never give it back, right? The world has already changed so much that the place from which it originated and the biography of the object and the treatment of the object in between have both changed, right? The object and the place itself have changed and ended up as Felwine Sarr at a conference I attended, the co-author of the famous report for Macron after he called for the restitution of African heritage to Africa. Felwine called this the changing ecologies of valuation, of appreciation of objects in the place where they were, from which they were originally removed. And this is both fascinating anthropologically speaking, in an intellectual sense, and I think that distance towards the processes itself is necessary because we need moments when we can temporarily dissociate ourselves from the strong affects and emotions that are connected with all these processes of creating more equitable relationships between people. But on the other hand, precisely those questions about what kind of empathy is is valuable, what kind of exoticism is not toxic, play a role here if we are to decide what to do with these particular collections, how to exhibit them, whom to involve, with whom to collaborate in exhibiting cultures, so to speak. Because there was one moment during that same conference at which I listened to Philween Sarr, which took place in Cologne and contained a lot of comments on current research in Germany that had to do with things forcibly taken often from Namibia, right? Especially during the Herero and Nama wars, which are officially classified, I think, as a genocide by the German army. And there was a Namibian woman who had helped German curators with a certain collection, I think in the Berlin Ethnological Museum. And she started to describe a puppet that was among these collections. And she said, I used to make puppets like that when I was a child. My grandmother taught me to do that, with the same kind of dress and the same kind of materials, and I played with those puppets. And then I have to think of the child from whom that puppet was taken by a group of soldiers who most likely did something really, really nasty to her, right? Killed her, whatever, or other things. At that point, you could see the whole audience suddenly snapping into another mode, making that life maybe not because it was exotic, but because it was so recognizable to everyone. Making it possible to empathize with that situation, and all of a sudden shutting up about all kinds of intellectual debates about restitution. Everybody basically at that moment should say, yes, if this is the background to what we have in museums, then we have to really consider giving stuff back. Right? And that made a big impression on me, but it also taught me something about the whole, some of the things that we neglected also as critical anthropologists, that there are, if you say that you are a student of social relationships and you do research by setting up social relationships, which implies that you see yourself as a social person, even if you are a researcher, then one of the obvious consequences is that you also learn to balance sentiment, knowledge, intellect, emotion, right? That you stop, as it were, sort of cordoning off a certain type of intellectual product from the other ways of being human. And those ways are either things that can raise your curiosity. I haven't seen that before. That is, I think, sort of positive exoticism. Or it is this sense of empathy that you have, oh my God, I realize now what this means to someone, how this feels, or at least I've seen that somebody feels something strongly about this. And this is a sense of discovery that that extends, as far as I'm concerned, also very much to my own African work, because actually most of the work on Africa that I do is across the Atlantic, reading things like the autobiography of Malcolm X, reading things like The Souls of Black Folk, and thinking about what it means to be African if you're not in Africa. And even more interestingly, when you then return to Africa, which a lot of African Americans of course do, which is a neglected topic, and is something I would like to do before I end my career as an anthropologist. So becoming more of a global Africa expert.